Welcome, everybody, to the new Lyre podcast. I'm David Goslin, and I'm joined by our guest, Adam Cedia. Welcome, Adam Cedia.
Good to be back.
So we're going to be discussing a very, very fascinating book today that we would recommend to everybody, and it's called The Intellectuals and the Masses, Pride and Prejudice Among the Literary Intelligentsia by literary critic John Carey. And this is going to be a jump-off point for a broader discussion of the questions of modernism and the questions of timeless poetry, situating our current age of poetry within the greater historical arc of 20th century literature. And we should probably provide a bit of a trigger warning for people, right, Adam? People might not expect this, but a discussion of the origins of modernism probably does warrant a trigger warning, because there's some very shocking stuff in terms of how many of these so-called intellectuals, or the modernist intellectuals of the early 20th century, what their views on humanity were, right? Their views on history and how this translates into their works and their compositional approach.
I think shocking is a fair way to characterize it.
Yes. So let's just start with a quote here. I'm gonna read a quote, and people can see if they know who said this. "If I had my way, I would build a lethal chamber as big as the Crystal Palace, with a military band playing softly and a cinematograph working brightly. And then I'd go out in back streets and main streets and bring them all in, all the sick, the maimed. I would lead them gently, and they would smile me a wary thanks." Who wrote that? Wow. It was actually D.H. Lawrence, one of the leading modernist writers. This was in a letter to Blanche Jennings on October 9th, 1908. So this discussion of not only lethal chambers, but this theme of eliminating masses of humanity, the mass, right? This was an underlying theme that propelled a lot of the writing and the artistic approach of many of the leading modernists, which is quite shocking.
Here's another quote along those same lines. It has become apparent that the whole masses of human population are, as a whole, inferior in their claim upon the future to other masses, that they cannot be given opportunities or trusted with power as the superior peoples are trusted, that their characteristic weaknesses are contagious and detrimental in the civilizing fabric, and that their range of incapacity tempts and demoralizes the strong. To give them equality is to sink to their level, to protect and cherish them is to be swamped in their fecundity. And that was H.G. Wells.
Yes, and what's surprising, what's shocking is, and I in a sense, if we actually know the historical background, eugenics, this pseudoscience, was very popular. And it was popular among many of these leading intellectuals, from George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley, Yeats. They all believed in eugenics, right? They all believed in race science and the genetic and biological superiority, Huxley calls it the hereditary principle.
Yes. That was science. That was the wave of the future at the time. And in fact, my own state, Indiana, was the first state to enact mandatory forced sterilizations of mental hospital patients. And it did that, I want to say it was 1914, give or take a few years. But this was standard, and it was public policy in the United States and Europe and many other places.
Yeah. So I mean, why is this relevant, or this should be shocking for anybody? But one of the important points that I think is worth making is that, especially with 20th century art, modern art, and this idea of a close reading, right? There was this idea that you could sort of separate the work, right, the text on the page, from the actual person writing it, when in fact, a final work, a piece of art, and the mind that generated it are inextricably tied in one way or another. How they're tied and all that, that's something that we can explore, and it varies from artist to artist.
Literature is ultimately about ideas. It's naive to suggest that the ideas of the author have nothing to do with the text they create. And ideas are so enthusiastically embraced as they were by these modernists, they cannot help but affect their works. And if I could also interject, where this ultimately leads is the conclusion of the book uh, brings up the Third Reich and the ideas of Hitler uh, as expressed in Mein Kampf. And the conclusion is that Hitler's idea, and indeed would have been, and in many cases were explicitly endorsed by these modernist authors. Yet in our age, Hitler does not get a pass, yet these authors do. And what I think the goal of Carrie's book and what the goal of this podcast is, we're not advocating burning books or anything like that, but we want to place these, in many cases, darlings of academia, such as Virginia Woolf and George Bernard Shaw and D.H. Lawrence, in proper context and understand them correctly and fully.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's something for the whole idea of, anybody who subscribes to an idea of eugenics or some sort of, natural aristocracy, which is, Carrie talks about this idea of natural aristocrats, is obviously subscribing to a kind of elite ideology, right? Elitism. And that plays out in their writing. If we ask the question, who were the modernists writing for? You've written, Adam, a great essay on Eliot called Clarity and Obscurity, Eliot's Masks, which is part of a greater series. But this piece, Eliot's Masks, really goes through, what was Eliot's compositional style? Who was he writing for? And if we can go modernist after modernist, right? The avant-garde class, who they were writing for was a very specific grouping. It wasn't really for the quote unquote mass. And that itself, the idea of the mass, creates all sorts of it creates a chasm, right, between the idea that everybody has an intrinsic power to reason, to discover, imagination, and it's something that can be cultivated, versus the idea that there's only this small grouping or class of people that really have the sensibilities to appreciate great art and you receive profound ideas. And just to add to that, I mean, think of Aeschylus, think of Homer, think of Dante, right? Who were they writing for? They were some of the greatest poets and writers that have ever lived, but they weren't writing for a small class of people. They were actually writing to elevate the imaginations, the thoughts, to educate the population. But that assumes that people can be elevated and educated, and that it's a great thing to do to participate in the development of culture and society. However we do it, that it's a good thing. And poets play a very important role in that.
In the case of Aeschylus and Homer, those works were designed primarily for performance. So one didn't need to be literate in order to appreciate them.
Right.
They were there for popular consumption. Where the modernists deviate from that, I think it's important to lay some context, and Kerr does a good job of setting the historical and societal context. In the 19th century, Europe, and Britain in particular, experienced a population explosion.
Right.
And at the same time, there was a mass movement to the cities and the beginnings of public education. And this was in both Europe, America, but again, the focus is primarily on Britain. Had the buildings of a modern economy with mechanization of agriculture. You had more of a professional class, an urban professional class developing, and you had an unprecedented, at I think probably any time in history, mass of educated, literate people consuming literature as a mass product. And you had the beginnings of the modern media, newspaper, and publishing industries. You had popular novels. And as a reaction to that, you had this group of modernists who saw that the popularization of vulgarization. And so, as a reaction against that, one of the things they did was intentionally develop a style that was not popular because it was not accessible to all but either the most erudite uh, or 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 shall we say, an unconventional stream of consciousness sort of reader. And there's a quotation from T.S. Eliot in this book. Um, Poets in our civilization as it exists at present must be difficult. Uh, and if you read The Wasteland, the publisher insisted on printing it with the footnotes because the references were so arcane that only a PhD student with Eliot's level of immersion would be able to catch all the references without footnotes. And Eliot, that was his intent in writing that way, was not to appeal to the masses because, according to this outlook, high art or real art did not appeal to the masses. And I'll let you take over from there.
Right. Well, I mean, I think this is where, this podcast is dedicated to the question of timeless poetry, right? And the promotion of timeless art and culture. And if we look at how a lot of these leading modernists approach the question of art, I'd say it was in, Eliot's Wasteland is a perfect example of how it was really misguided. And I find it interesting, kind of funny to listen to academics today talk about, some of them who really like Eliot, and they're saying this is really important, and, get your appendix, right, with your guide so that you can understand all the references and all that. And I mean, one just has to wonder, though, is that really making the work any more profound, any more timeless? Did Keats or Shakespeare really need to, embed all these references and all that nobody could really understand in order to make their works work and be timeless and communicate profound ideas? Sure, you could have the deeper you would go, the more you would read into it, the more you could find out. But the point is that you could still grasp a universal idea without needing to know who, the Duke of Burgundy at, some Parisian brasserie in, 1875, who that was and what was happening on that Thursday, which is.
Or providing untranslated quotes from not very widely read 16th century dramas in French like T.S. Eliot does in The Wasteland.
Right. And it becomes, the point is, it becomes a gimmick. You know, anybody could, you know, we'll learn some Latin and we're going to start throwing in Latin quotes into an English poem. And it's just up to the people to sort of figure it out. And, you know, is it even really elevating the work, or it's just making the person, it's just keeping it out of reach in a sense? You don't need that to communicate a timeless idea. So I think it speaks to this whole elite idea, which is very problematic even today. It's different today, but there is still this idea of the classes who can appreciate so-called, you know, great art, contemporary art, modernist art, and those who just don't get it. And if you don't get it, it's just because, you know, there's something wrong with you. You don't have the sensibility necessary, and you're asking all sorts of wrong questions, like what is the meaning of this work and all that, instead of just experiencing the pure aesthetical effect. Right.
It's I would say it's exactly the same dynamic. Just the people, the self-anointed, don't use the word aristocracy to describe themselves. They use, you know, words like you know, virtuous, or a thing which I think is worse, because there's a distinction of the good people are those who get this, and if you don't, you're either a Philistine or a rube. And it's that urban and then suburban rural divide that we is well noted in America, at least.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this question of timeless poetry, all the more now that we're in the 21st century, the modernist experiment has been done, and it yielded some useful insights, and it also created a lot of confusion and disparity among the a general readership. And I think one of the important things to, I think, strive for, if for people who are actually concerned or interested in creating 21st century timeless art, timeless poetry, um, or appreciating it, it's really, how do you communicate something profound in a way that's universal, right? In a way that's just not, it's not navel gazing, right? Which is what a lot of the artistic ideas today in poetry, contemporary verse, are centered around this idea of lived, you know,
Experience.
lived experience, and, you know, one's personal. It's very self-referential, and we're just supposed to listen to it. And, you know, well, you can't really question somebody's feelings, right? I mean, feelings are by their nature, everybody has their own feelings. In a sense, they're very arbitrary, right? Everybody has their different feelings, and there's nothing, you can't really judge a feeling per se. You know what I mean? If the person feels the way they feel and they just start writing about it, it's not, it today, a lot of that passes as poetry, when it's really just descriptive, sort of direct sense perceptual.
It's a diary entry masquerading as a poem. But that directly results from modernism, where the goal of writing was to n- induce a feeling in a reader that could vary with the reader. You know, it was as poetry was not the expression of idea; it was it was a stimulus to any one of a number of responses in any reader, and for that it justified its abstruseness uh, by that goal of eliciting that reaction. But
Right.
I think what Carrie gets at is there's something deeper, is the aristocratic or the self-anointed aristocratic mindset of modernism and modernists. As uh, a chosen few separate from and above the unwashed masses.
Right. And I think that it's important because it speaks to a certain worldview. And again, poetry, art is a reflection of a universe, of the universe that the poet, the artist is treating or in some way inhabiting, right? When we're talking about fiction, of course, it's not real, but in a sense, it's more real because it's allowing one to work out concepts and ideas and an outlook that doesn't necessarily translate into the immediate reality of everything, but which speaks to those, to the assumptions that the poet or the artist is operating under and is ultimately communicating and imparting through their imaginative works. And I think maybe today this sounds a bit more foreign because there's there's much more self-referential stuff today. There's a lot of lived experience where in a sense there's an absence of idea. People don't know. I mean, I think I'd argue that there's a shortage. People don't really have anything to say, and I would just relate. I took a creative writing course. Um,
I'm sorry.
Pardon me.
Sorry.
Um, I took a creative writing course at Concordia University here in Montreal, and it was a fascinating experience. But what was really interesting is that most of the we had to write three short stories. It was a great class. The setup was great. Everybody would have to write three stories. Everybody would read everybody else's stories, one story at a time, and we would all workshop it. Right? Everybody would come to class having read, these three stories by these three people, and we would have to discuss them. And most of the people, their short stories were ultimately just biographical sketches. Imagine,
Autobiographical.
yeah, and they didn't really have many ideas, to be quite honest. They didn't really have. Uh, it was a lot of just what's in the universities, sort of the prism of current social justice or whatnot. But it was ultimately autobiographical, and there was just a lack of content. It was very focused on the lived experience, taking people in that moment. I want to experience that moment with you. But then the question becomes, well, what's the point? And ultimately, I never actually asked that because I knew I would probably be attacked. I listened more. Um, but what was the point? And the point is that there is no point there, or there you shouldn't really. That's the wrong question, right? That in a sense you're just supposed to experience that, and it's very existential. But where does this come from, right? This sort of uh, you know this idea that you can just sort of throw out images and describe one's feelings and sort of try and put that all together in a very sort of aesthetic way, and you're supposed to get art. Where does this
Well,
idea come from?
and that's what modernism started out as. That's what cubism in visual arts was, and that cubist. For those who haven't read my essays or unfamiliar, cubism is best exemplified by painters like Pablo Picasso or Juan Gris or I can't remember the guy, a French artist. But they did was try to portray an object from all angles at once. So you would have, for example, a human face, and you would have one eye one way and another eye another way. How what people think of when they think of Picasso, and it was supposed to view the object from all angles. Well, what modernism in literature does is adopt this same technique where you have a stream of consciousness narrative where it's just sensory perceptions in a series, sometimes from different points of view, with nothing more. Virginia Woolf did this. Faulkner did this. T.S. Eliot does it in The Wasteland from multiple points of view. And it constructs a disjointed narrative that the reader is supposed to assemble into a holistic image in his own mind, just like the viewer of a cubist work is supposed to do. And that's modernist technique. And its grandchild, what we see today, is what you get in mainstream contemporary poetry, which lists self-referential descriptors, mere descriptors of any one of a number of things. I'm thinking of the last three inaugural poems as examples of these. That's the that's what modernism has devolved into, and it's an outlook that really hasn't changed for the past 100 years. So it doesn't even have the benefit of being new or fresh.
Hmm. Yeah. So it's really I think people, in order to really get a sense of to take on the question of where does art and poetry go from here, I think it's important to situate the question within the historical arc of the origins of modernism and its development over time. And that unless people are conscious of the ideas and philosophical assumptions that are ultimately playing on their own interpretations today, right? What's being taught in the universities and schools, unless they're mindful of where these ideas actually come from, right? And in what kind of mind were these aesthetic principles born? Um, it's there's going to be a lot of confusion, and I think John Kerry really does a good job of pointing out that virtually all of these modernist writers had very dark views on humanity, and they didn't see the whole of humanity as really something that was worth developing, and to have that universal spark that exists in every human being, to have that developed. Most of them were concerned with the fact that a lot more people were gaining literacy, right? We're having access to books and newspapers, the advent of newspapers, and Kerry documents how all these modernist intellectuals really hated newspapers. They hated the popular, I guess, I mean, we could call it today popular art, a popular entertainment. There was that aspect which they were revolting against, but they didn't think that most people should really have the capacity to cultivate higher sentiments, right? And to appreciate profound ideas.
Yeah, and
So,
as an example of that, there was a publication. Um, it sounds kind of naughty to today's ears, but it's the name of the publication is Titbits.
right.
And just I'm reading from Carey here. Starting in May 1882, weekly numbers carried pages of excerpts from selected authors, among them Thackeray, George Eliot, Scott, Trollope, Charles Kingsley, Carlyle, Macaulay, Harriet Martineau, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Emerson, Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, Jules Verne, Ruskin, Addison, Steele, Victor Hugo, Hawthorne, Lamb, and Goldsmith. Other early issues carried a previously unpublished poem by Longfellow and an interview with an acquaintance of Dickens. Soon the paper was serializing novels, including those by Arthur Conan Doyle. So this was not lowbrow by today's standards at all, yet the intellectuals of the day regularly made fun of this publication and scoffed at it and saw it as lowbrow, For a class of people, they commonly deride it as clerks, which refers to the lower middle class, white collar, suburban class that had emerged, and for which these intellectuals held nothing but the utmost contempt.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's this idea of overpopulation is something that Carey really stresses, that among all these intellectuals, I mean, overpopulation, if whether you look at the Huxley brothers, whether you look at H.G. Wells, I mean, we read the quote by D.H. Lawrence. Eliot was saying that it was not a good thing for there to be uh, general education, because it was just going to sort of dilute the quality, and you would just have a whole horde of um, you know uh, Huxley called it the new stupid, but this horde of not very well educated people who wanted good standards of living and would ultimately become more of a weight on society. And so this view is popular today. I think that's what a lot of people have to wrestle with, is even people who don't necessarily think, have any sort of bad intention towards the human species. I think a lot of them would still, if they investigate their own axioms, they have a very pessimistic view of the nature of human beings. And I mean, today it takes all sorts of, environmentalism, ecology has a very sort of cynical idea about what the place of human beings is in so-called nature.
Well, I
There's
mean,
nature,
population reduction is a huge part of that.
yeah, which is a Malthusian. It's all based on this Malthusian idea, which there are all sorts of alternative ideas that refute Malthusianism, but or even a Darwinian evolution, right? These concepts, which to this day are sort of treated as these untouchable principles, the second law of thermodynamics. If we go back in time to when these concepts were being discussed, there was all sorts of other theories, right? If we talk about evolution, there was the idea of cephalization, that the human biology is actually tending towards cognition, that if we look at the evolution of life on the planet, it's actually becoming, it's tending towards more complexity. Not the second law of thermodynamics is saying that everything is ultimately tending towards a less and less randomness, towards this ultimate homogenization. So we're in this closed system, and things are going from more complex to less complex because all the energy is going to be consumed, and we're just going to reach this point of blah, where the whole
Well,
universe.
the second law of thermodynamics, all it is says is that delta S is greater than zero. Um, what that means, though, is you have two considerations: the system and the surroundings. And if the entropy of the system, however it is defined, is increasing, for example, human biology, the system, the entropy of the surrounding, or I guess should be delta S is greater than zero. Yeah. The entropy of the system is decreasing, i.e., it's becoming more ordered. Then the entropy of the surroundings is increasing, which means to a greater degree, which means as the system becomes more ordered, the surroundings become less ordered, which you could say with the production of waste and consumption still follows the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah, it's ultimately, though, the point from I think the point is that a lot of these ideas, which were very popular then and are still popular, play on people's imaginations, and their are sort of axiomatic and shape the way they think more than people might be consciously aware. But the point of the second law of thermodynamics is that ultimately life is a zero-sum game. And it ultimately becomes politically, it becomes an argument for there being a ruling class, right, an empire that can actually govern over the masses, with the idea, the very cynical idea, that if we just leave people with their hyper democracies and their demands for quality of life and all that, basically the limited resources are just going to be consumed, right? More and more space is going to be taken, more and more resources are going to be consumed, and this is only going to accelerate the heat death of ultimately it's the heat death of the universe, but the ultimate entropy of the earth, of the human species. So this is
Well, and a lot of that has to do with, again, the development of the London suburbs, and the destruction of both the or the use of the destruction of the wilderness, the countryside around London, in which many of these authors had grown up. So there was a lot of sense of personalness. The other element of this, which I found fascinating, is there was a reverence, an almost cult-like reverence among these intellectual authors for peasants, as much as they despised the literate suburban white-collar classes. They thought the peasantry, of which there really wasn't any left at the time, they regarded as somehow genuine, or the genuine uh, representatives of a nation or a culture. And you, to the point where even I think D.H. Lawrence was going to Mexico uh, so you have this idolization of the nobles, or something just above the noble savage.
right, the noble
uh,
peasant.
yes, the noble peasant. And at the same time, that shows that they prefer a society to consist of a mass of peasants rather than literate, somewhat educated, uh, suburban professional classes
Yeah.
with disposable money.
Yeah, and here's some quotes which we should have probably read earlier, but so people get a sense that this is serious. D.H. Lawrence is saying that everyone can learn to read will ruin in the long run not only writing but thinking too. Let all schools be closed at once, he exhorts. The great mass of humanity should never learn to read and write. So this is from his letters. You have Yeats, who was really into eugenics, and he wrote an essay that talked about eugenics on the boiler. I believe that's what it's called. And he writes, sooner or later we must limit the families of the unintelligent classes. Going on, the last check upon the multiplication of the ineducable masses. This was the role of eugenics, right? Of sort of, which is always just you know uh, presented as this idea of helping natural selection along, right? By is sort of increasing education and standard of living, you're ultimately just creating more useless eaters, and you're creating a mass of people who would have, quote unquote, naturally died off, right, from sickness and disease or poverty. And so you're creating an unnatural state, right? And this is the whole idea of Malthusianism, right? So Malthusianism, eugenics, uh, this was a lot of these modernists felt very strongly about these ideas. They really had this elitist mindset, and it does get revealed in how they chose to create art, right? In their artistic principles. And I think it's important that people recognize that context and situate themselves within that context, and really get rid of this whole close reading idea, which it can be useful maybe for certain technical literary questions, but you can't really separate the works from the minds which gave these works life. And I think that's recognizing that is important if we really want to see a revival of timeless art and timeless poetry, which isn't just concerned with, you know, a pure aesthetical experience, but is actually working out very difficult and profound concepts where the conclusion isn't always just that everything is meaningless and all we have are these immediate sense perceptions, or that the Nietzschean variety on that everything is meaningless, so let me create my own meaning, which ultimately just leads to all sorts of really insanity and actually very dark and very scary things, like the rise of Nazism, whether people like that or not. The point is, if you're an Ubermensch, if you're going to create your own reality, right, because there is no truth, and you see this mass of people, this mass of useless eaters, right, this mass of inferior races, which is really how H.G. Wells talks about it. Another one of these writers writing in the early 20th century. I mean, it does just, if you have this Nietzschean outlook, and you really believe that the Malthusian you know principles apply to the human species, that these are actually true, then yeah, if there's no choice, there's no choice. This is what a lot of these imperialists feel justified, right? Who cares if millions of people are going to die? Ultimately, they're
No,
going
it's
to
not
die.
beyond who cares. That's the goal. While you were saying here's another from this is from George Bernard Shaw that Carrie brings up. This is from Shaw's preface to On the Rocks. And I quote, "Extermination must be put on a scientific basis if it is ever to be carried out humanely and apologetically as well as thoroughly. If we desire a certain type of civilization and culture, we must exterminate the sort of people who do not fit into it."
Right.
And that was implemented.
And here's a follow-up. This is by H.G. Wells. There's a whole chapter entitled H.G. Wells Getting Rid of People, which really has some juicy quotes here. This is from H.G. Wells's The Sleeper Wakes. He says, he calls them people of the abyss. People of the abyss, Carey writes, for these, quote, great useless masses of people, he adopts the term, quote, people of the abyss. And he predicts that the, quote, nation that most resolutely picks over, educates, sterilizes, exports, or poisons its people of the abyss, end quote, will be in the ascendant. So this is Hitler stuff. This is pure Nazism, this is pure fascism. And H.G. Wells really believed this. He actually gave a speech, I believe it was at Oxford, where he called for a liberal fascisti. So he believed in implementing all these ideas of eugenics and population control by all sorts of hideous means. But he just felt that there was a different way to go about it, right? And that Hitler kind of got messy. That's what a lot of the imperialists ultimately thought. Is even Bertrand Russell, Huxley, right? It was way too messy for them, but they
Yeah,
were eugenicists, unrepentant eugenicists until their dying breaths.
H.G. Wells was a Malthusian. He thought that nuclear war or disease would wipe out most of humanity by the mid 1950s, and the population would, after that, return much more to what today we would call sustainable level. Obviously, that didn't happen, and history disproved Malthus or discredited Malthus because the planet, obviously there are environmental impacts, but the planet is still able to support many exponentially many times more people than the numbers Wells was concerned about.
Right. I mean, this ultimately leads into a totally different discussion, but it's ultimately, I think this is the point, that in literature, a lot of fundamental concepts are being worked out. And if people aren't able to have certain discussions of policy, economics, history, a lot of these, many of these themes might not sort of resound with people in the way that they will resound with, let's say, an imperialist, who's reading H.G. Wells and, the War of the World. John Kerry talks about how H.G. Wells is so comfortable with, and he's quite giddy about the mass extermination of people in so many of his stories. And I mean, things like War of the Worlds. I actually watched that recently, and yeah, people are just getting wiped out by the millions. But there's this sense of, well, there people are just these small, insignificant things. And I mean, the whole Malthusian idea, yeah, just to say, I mean, people talk about limited resources, but if we look at what most of our resources are today, if you go back a few hundred years, they weren't even considered resources. Oil, petroleum, this wasn't a resource until we actually developed combustion engines, which requires all sorts of metallurgy and, all sorts of mechanical principles that need to be applied. Before that, oil was considered a curse on your land because most of society was based on an agricultural form of economy. So you couldn't use your farmland. So it was a bad thing. And I mean, if we look today, and when you look at the space age, and it's interesting that Wells anticipates a lot of this. But if we look at the space age today, or where the world might be in 100 years, I mean, most of the resources that could be used by humanity are not even on Earth. If you look at helium-3 on the moon, if you consider all the asteroids and all, I mean, which are pretty infinite, right? But this is actually, so a lot of these literary ideas, if we look at Huxley's Brave New World, or even The Island, or H.G. Wells in all his, whether it's his very dark views of human nature, which he continually presents in new, original, and imaginative ways with things like The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, uh, War of the Worlds. Humans are always either these beasts or these insignificant things which can be killed en masse, and or they should be, or they just I mean, Time Machine, right? Adam, you said you recently revisited The Time Machine.
Yeah, this morning.
Civilization is split between two classes. You have
Yes, and not only that, both the aristocratic class and the subjected class have lost the ability to reason, and they've been reduced to the mental level of young children or animals.
Mhm. Yeah, and this theme always comes back that humanity is somehow going to destroy itself. And in some cases, with some authors like Huxley, that assumption that you have to just sort of take that as something self-evident is what then warrant the mass eugenics program, the mass population control, and the scientific dictatorships. Huxley was big on, Wells was big on this too, right? The idea of a scientific priesthood. And a lot of it was organized around this idea of nature worship, right? Of idolizing nature, and really sort of having, I mean, you find this a lot even today, right? There's this sort of,
Oh, yeah, the science says,
well,
as if it were.
you have this idea of pristine nature, and then human beings came along and dirtied everything, and that progress is really like this original sin. And I mean, at best, right, what's the idea today with environmentalism? At best, humanity is good if it's living in this perfect equilibrium defined by these fixed boundary conditions, ultimately Malthusian principles of fixed resources and, limited space. And at best, human beings are in this perfect equilibrium with nature where they don't really change anything. They don't really disturb this arbitrary balance that supposedly exists. That's at best. At worst, human beings are
A
a
plague.
plague, a scourge on the earth. And the best thing that we can do is to limit one's footprint, right? One's impact in such a way that ultimately it's as if human beings don't exist, right? The idea of carbon footprint coming to zero, I mean, people can argue about this in all sorts of different ways, but ultimately the idea is limit humanity's impact on Earth such that it's as if humanity wasn't really present. And this is very dark, and it's very popular. But again, when we look at the origins of these ideas and how it has worked its way, the origins of these ideas around modernism, I mean, it was around before, but the way it sort of uh, uh, colored the imagination of people in the 20th century, and still does today. I mean, a lot of you find this everywhere. It's a very dark view of humanity, and it overlooks certain basic principles about the evolution of life and the evolution of human species, which is not biological, right? The evolution of the human species is based on the evolution of ideas. It's based on the generation of new scientific discoveries and new principles. So even the idea of limited resources is in many ways axiomatically flawed, because what are you talking about, the present resources, or are you talking about the resources that we haven't yet discovered? What do you know about the resources that we haven't yet discovered, right? Like, what do you know about fusion power? Are you following the science? Are you a fusion scientist? No. So there's all these limited ideas, and I think the point with somebody like Wells, less so with some of the other modernists. Wells wasn't a modernist as such, but he was writing in that time, is that they're working on your imagination. Doesn't mean they're doing it consciously, but that's the point, that there are certain axioms that underlie what's shaping their imagination. Those axioms are shaping the imagination, and those need to be investigated. And with Wells, it's very clear that he's outlining this imperialist, rabidly pro-eugenics outlook. And it's really, I mean, you can see it today in Hollywood. The interesting thing, I mean, these aren't even conspiracies. That's what's kind of funny. I mean, I feel like somebody might say this is a conspiracy theory, but Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, I mean, they were.
Well, it's not a theory. It is an actual conspiracy. These people were in correspondence, and they openly advocated these ideas. This isn't secret.
Right. I have the quote here for Julian Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's brother, and he was the founder of UNESCO. He was its first director. Sorry, and he wrote, at the moment, if people think this is crazy, it's all going to make sense very soon. At the moment, it is probable that this is in the UNESCO, its principles and philosophy, the founding document, its purpose and its philosophy. He writes, at the moment, it is probable that the indirect effect of civilization is dysgenic instead of eugenic. And in any case, it seems likely that the dead weight of genetic stupidity, physical weakness, mental instability, and disease proneness, which already exist in the human species, will prove too great a burden for real progress to be achieved. Thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable.
And this was,
Pardon me, you cut out.
oh, this was written after World War II,
This was
correct?
written in 1946. So, I mean,
Right after.
and what I was getting at is that this eugenics idea, if you look at cinema today, a lot of Hollywood movies, I mean, the idea of genetic improvement of human beings, I mean, whether it's all in these superhero movies, some sort of technological improvement of one's biology. Um, it's this is always how eugenics was packaged. Just to be clear, it's always the idea that we're just helping evolution along. They're talking about the fourth industrial revolution at the Davos conference, the World Economic Forum, and it's all based on applying technology, integrating digital technology into one's biology, all based on the idea that we're going to improve human beings. Genetic modification. You find this in Hollywood movies all the time, and it's, again, I think we have to have people like H.G. Wells, Huxley in mind, who have very strong beliefs, very strong convictions, and they're trying to communicate their ideas through fiction by not telling people what to think, but by coloring their imaginations and shaping their imaginations. And so today it's very popular to be like, yeah, we're gonna, I mean, all this digital stuff, right? People already talk about, getting implants that are going to help the brain sort of function, calculate better, do this, do that. So when I read Julian Huxley's, that now much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable. I mean, it's actually quite present in pop culture, and one needs to sort of trace the genesis and development of these ideas in culture, um, in art, and of course in science and history. But there's a continuity there.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see it in any of the superhero films where there's this elite group of, in many cases, genetically modified people or superhumans on whom the unwashed, unnamed faceless masses of humanity depend for salvation. It all stems from this.
Yeah, and I mean, people might, object in all sorts of different ways, but the point is that if you think about how people are presented with the idea of changing the world, it's usually in some sort of, there's always this Nietzschean sort of power struggle, right? How, the strong, who's going to, through strength somehow overcome the enemy. And then these superhero movies, I mean, there's always been superhero movies, but ultimately, if you want to change the world, right, you need some sort of either superpower, you need some sort of digital enhancement. I mean, there's this movie Limitless with Bradley Cooper. There's Hannah on Amazon Prime. If you look at shows like, my God, Utopia, or movies like Kingsman, I mean, some of these are much more explicit, right, in their messages, but there's always this playing around with genetics and biology to create, this stronger, to gain this advantage. And it never really talks about, how you can gain an advantage in another way, right? by, actually uh, making real discoveries, poetic leaps in one's thinking, and communicating a higher sense of humanity, which allows people to think in ways that just being stuck in the sort of mundane, daily grind sort of prevents you from doing, or becomes, makes it more difficult. But then when you witness a great piece of art, by something like Aeschylus, Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and giving it to mankind, and fire, knowledge of fire is really creativity. Or if you look at Shakespeare through his tragedies, and how Shakespeare is allowing people to see how, through an investigation of one's own axioms, or the lack of investigation of one's own axioms, has all sorts of consequences. And that ultimately avoiding a tragedy has to do with being able, having the power to change one's axioms. That's what real power is, the ability to change one's axioms, to make creative leaps, to make fundamental leaps in knowledge, which any individual ultimately has the ability to cultivate these capacities. You don't need a chip in your brain to make you, think clearer. But if we look at pop culture today,
But if you treat humanity as defective, or a group of humans as or dehumanized, a computer chip will improve them.
yeah,
That's the difference in outlook.
yeah, and I mean, I think people hearing this might, I can hear a million different objections here, but I think the point, we started talking about modernism, and the point is that if you accept a dark and pessimistic view of human nature, then a lot of these things which seem unthinkable, or might seem unthinkable at a certain, on a certain timeline, as things get worse, we could say in the real world, if you hold certain axioms, I mean, it's actually through your imagination that you can see, will carry that logic to its, carry that thinking to its logical conclusion. And a lot of things that seem unthinkable actually become thinkable. If there really is overpopulation and there's not a lot of food, a lot of things that seem unthinkable will actually become thinkable for people. But the question is, are we able to think differently? And great art is vital in giving people the ability to think in more nuanced terms, and to see things that they didn't see before, but not just in this existentialist sort of, oh, I didn't see that, guy that was, killing the hookers before. Oh my God. But that's probably a terrible example. But this whole existential sort of, I'm aware of whatever, the tree or the building or the dove on, some, some high rise. It's great art allows one to make, allows one to gain new fundamental insights into what it means to be human. So there is this question of, ultimately art is always addressing this question of what it means to be human, because it's being created by human beings, and we need to investigate that. It's not just about feelings.
Well, in art, yes, it's created for human beings because it speaks to them. Human. If art were nothing, it wouldn't exist. I know that seems kind of tautological, but
Yeah.
it's fundamental. It's a fundamental part of the human experience, both expressing and um, appreciating it.
Yeah. And I mean, so if we have that in mind, I think if we revisit a lot of the modernists' work, I mean, what really stands out is that, while a lot of them write technically, they technically a lot of their writing is very good, but if we actually look for substance and content, um, I mean, the absence of substance and content is often the, you know, the unifying theme in a lot of these works, whether we're talking about Hart Crane and his voyages, whether we're talking about T.S. Eliot and his Wasteland. I mean, his poem's literally about, you know, how everything good is gone, in a sense, right? The classical culture, traditions. We
Yes,
just have this
in
wasteland
World War One.
now. And I mean, maybe that seemed original then, but the point is, if you just take that standpoint that there's really nothing left, um, you know, and if you we read more and more of these modernists, it just gets darker and darker, and people often just retreat then into pure sort of hedonism, right, and more extreme forms of sensual entertainment or distraction, because it's not like there's ideas worth fighting for, right? Prometheus was fighting to steal fire from the gods and give it to humanity. Who in the modernist school really had a Promethean idea, right? That human beings, the knowledge of fire is something worth fighting for, but not
No,
only.
fire, it was the opposite. Fire was something to be kept from the mass of humanity, lest they burn themselves.
Exactly. And that's where the imperial idea really becomes acceptable or thinkable for a lot of people. And much of it has to do with how one's imagination has been impacted over years. But at the same time, I was having a discussion with a friend, and he also made the point that it also speaks to the great power of art. Uh, the fact that one great piece of art can actually break the spell of of pessimism that people might have been, you know, because they were bombarded with so many dark ideas of humanity, so many cynical ideas of human nature, and yet one good piece of art that speaks to the profound nature of human beings can sort of uh, undo all that. So I think it's worth striving to create real timeless pieces of art, works of art that actually strive to do that in some way and to uncover the more fundamental nature of human beings, which is endless, right? That the potential of the human mind is endless. And so that the potential for creativity and discovery is endless. And I mean, the more scientific discoveries, the more of the universe that, you know, swims into humanity's ken, as Keats would say, the more art all of a sudden is going to change and is going to have new avenues of investigation, new themes, new imagery, as it always has.
Exactly. Um, and our point in doing this podcast is once more to place these modernist sacred cows for context and provide a fuller picture that both the academia and the popular culture neglect to provide, um, either through just sheer ignorance or through an agenda. This is a topic that needs to be discussed more, analyzed more, written about more, so that it can be understood more.
Right. And I mean, otherwise, we wouldn't really need to do this podcast. We would have done a podcast on something else.
Well, and Carrie's book wouldn't be such an eye opener.
Yeah. And
But it is, and it's sad that it has to be an eye opener, because these are quotations, these are things everybody with an interest in literature should know.
yeah, so I would really recommend everybody who's listening, regardless of where you are or what you do, um, get a copy of this, The Intellectuals and the Masses by John Carey, and I think it's going to give people a...
It's Carey. Now we're not confusing him with failed politicians.
John Carey, yeah, from the 1860s, I believe. We wouldn't have to do this if academia was really giving people the whole story. I think that's the point. And if they were really actually giving people the whole context of a lot of these modernists, what they believed, and having that sort of inform their understanding of what these artists were trying to do artistically, which wasn't very, I mean, it wasn't very noble, to be honest. It was quite, it was elitist. It was, it was,
It was cruel and it was anti-human.
yeah, that's probably, unfortunately, the best way to put it. And that might sound upsetting for a lot of people, but again, if one reads what many of these darlings of the modernist age believed, and how that translates into their artistic approach and their imaginative, their fiction, it'll become clear that these are very dark ideas and they shouldn't just be taken at face value. And content is important, right? Ideas are subject to reason, and art is ultimately about ideas. So artistic ideas are subject to investigation and they're subject to reason. Doesn't mean we're not talking about mathematical formalism or some sort of scientific formula that they sort of have to be uh, tested by. But there's just as much an idea of assumptions, axioms, outlook on the world, and these things have to be investigated, and it's worth it. And it'll also become inspiring if you don't like the ideas that you're uncovering. That will probably inspire you or challenge you to come up with a different way to approach it and a different way to communicate a different
and
quality.
and to reevaluate your own tastes and what is the received wisdom as to what is good literature. If you're forced to associate this with the ideas behind it, which, like we've said, the two are inseparable, uh, these works deserve a reevaluation.
Absolutely. So I'm sure we've upset enough people, and
I hope we have.
this has probably been our most controversial podcast. But I would just recommend to everybody, go order yourself a copy of The Intellectuals and the Masses by John Carey. You can find it on Amazon. Adam and I have both read it, and we were both blown away, and we felt compelled to have a discussion about it.
It's a copyright 1992, published by Academy Chicago Publishers out of Chicago.
Yeah, and we're gonna have a link to it in the description. We'll have the full title at least so people can search it. So with that said, I would like to thank you, Adam, for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for introducing me to this book. It was an eye-opener, and I would recommend it to everyone listening.
Absolutely. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back next week.
All right.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.